My name is Victoria. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people describe with gentle words, steady, reasonable, easy to work with. I've worked in roles that reward consistency more than visibility. I've been the person who remembers birthdays at the office, who stays late without announcing it, who listens more than she speaks. If you ask people who knew me back then, they might say I was lucky. Stable marriage, predictable life, no drama. That perception mattered more than I realized. People often mistake quiet for agreement. They confuse calm with compliance. I've learned that when you don't demand space, others decide how small you should be. I didn't resist that at first. I thought being underestimated was a kind of freedom. If no one expects much from you, no one watches too closely. This story isn't about rage or revenge. It's about a line I didn't know existed until I reached it, and what happened the night I refused to cross it. The title tells you one fact up front. I refused to cover up my spouse's crime, and our marriage ended that night. Love didn't survive the truth. What it doesn't tell you is how quietly everything fell apart, or how long the ending had been preparing itself without my awareness. What you're about to hear is not a confession, and it's not a warning wrapped in drama. It's an account, plain, honest, and uncomfortable at times, of how trust erodes when one person assumes the other will always absorb the damage. There are no heroes here, no shouting matches, no courtroom theatrics, just a series of small moments that stacked together made one decision inevitable. I'm telling this story because I don't believe silence is always a virtue. Sometimes it's just a delay. And sometimes, staying quiet long enough teaches other people exactly how far they think they can go. Over the course of this story, you'll hear about who I was in that marriage, the role I was assigned without being asked, and the slow internal shift that happened long before the truth surfaced. You'll hear about restraint, not as weakness, but as observation. And you'll hear about a moment when love was tested against integrity, and only one of them was allowed to remain. I won't dramatize what doesn't need drama. I won't exaggerate pain to make it persuasive. I'm not here to punish anyone through storytelling. I'm here because there are moments in life where choosing honesty costs you everything familiar and still feels like the only thing that lets you keep yourself. If you've ever been seen as the reasonable one, the person expected to smooth things over, I wonder, have you ever noticed how easily responsibility slides onto the quietest shoulders? To most people, I was useful. That's the simplest way to explain who I was in my marriage, at work, and in our shared social world. Useful people don't cause friction. They anticipate needs. They fill gaps before anyone notices there was one. I didn't become that way out of fear or insecurity. I became that way because it worked. It kept things running smoothly. It kept conversations calm. It kept me out of the spotlight. My husband used to introduce me as the organized one. Not brilliant, not decisive. Organized. He'd laugh when he said it, like it was a private joke we were both in on. People smiled, nodded, and moved on. No one asked what that meant in practice. At dinners, I was the one refilling glasses, quietly tracking who hadn't been served yet. In group decisions, I waited until everyone else spoke before adding a sentence or two that tied things together. When conflicts arose, eyes often turned to me, not because I was loud or persuasive, but because I was expected to translate chaos into something manageable. I rarely refused that role. Saying no felt unnecessary. Someone had to do it, and I was good at it. What I didn't realize then was that usefulness has a shadow side. When people rely on you to stabilize things, they also rely on you not to disrupt them. You become part of the infrastructure, invisible until you fail. My husband learned this early in our marriage. He learned that I didn't interrupt, that I didn't escalate, that if something made me uncomfortable, I'd process it privately first. He mistook that for flexibility. Or maybe he didn't mistake it at all. Maybe he understood it perfectly. When he forgot to mention decisions he'd already made, I adjusted. When he volunteered my time without asking, I followed through. When he dismissed concerns with, "You're overthinking it," I paused, reconsidered, and often let it go. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to be unfair. I was proud of being fair. Friends would say, "Victoria's so level-headed," usually after I smoothed over something awkward. Family members told me I was the strong one. At work, managers trusted me with sensitive tasks because I didn't gossip, didn't grandstand, didn't panic. No one noticed that being trusted to handle things slowly became being expected to absorb things. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes with competence. You're seen, but only in relation to function. Your inner life doesn't register because it doesn't interfere. I didn't talk much about my doubts or disappointments, not because they didn't exist, but because they felt irrelevant. I told myself I was choosing peace. Looking back, I can see how carefully I curated that image. Calm, reliable, unreactive. It protected me in some ways. It also trained everyone around me to assume I would always bend, never break, including my husband. He didn't see himself as unkind. He saw himself as decisive, pragmatic, and under pressure. And I was the person who made his world easier. When something went wrong, he believed I would help fix it. When lines blurred, he assumed I'd understand. When silence followed, he took it as consent. I didn't correct that assumption. Not at first. There's no single moment where I can say this is when I disappeared. It was gradual, 1,000 small accommodations. Each one is reasonable on its own. Each one was unremarkable enough that no one would question it, including me. I was not unhappy. That's important to say. I was functional, I was admired, I was trusted, and I was increasingly absent from my own decisions. This story doesn't begin with betrayal or crime. It begins with perception, with who people think you are and how dangerous it can be when that version of you is more convenient than the truth. Because when the moment finally came where I could no longer be useful, when usefulness would have required me to betray myself, everyone was shocked. I wasn't. The first time it happened, it was easy to dismiss. There was no raised voice, no argument that lingered in the air afterward. Just a brief moment, almost forgettable, where something I said was reduced to background noise. We were at a small gathering, standing in the kitchen of a friend's house, talking about work. Someone asked me a direct question about logistics, my area, my expertise. I began to answer. My husband interrupted me mid-sentence, not sharply, not rudely, just a casual override like finishing a thought that didn't belong to him. He reframed my answer in simpler terms, added a joke, and the conversation flowed on without me. No one reacted. No one looked back to see if I had more to say. I smiled. I took a sip of my drink. The moment passed. Later that night when we were alone, I mentioned it. Not accusingly, just an observation. I said something like, I was already answering that. He laughed, actually laughed, and said, You're too sensitive. I was just helping move things along. That phrase stayed with me, helping move things along. I told myself he was right. Social situations are messy. People interrupt. Intent matters. And his intent, I believed, wasn't to diminish me. It was efficiency, momentum. I'd built my entire identity around those values. Who was I to object when they were used against me? So I filed it away, a mental note, not a grievance. But the body remembers what the mind excuses. I started noticing how often my contributions were summarized by someone else, usually him. How my ideas were met with silence until repeated by a different voice. How decisions that affected both of us were discussed as if I were a stakeholder, not a partner. None of it was blatant. That's what made it effective. There was always plausible deniability, always a reasonable explanation, always a way for me to sound petty if I pressed the issue. And so I didn't. The strange thing is, I wasn't angry. I was alert, like a sensor had switched on quietly in the background. I began tracking moments, not to collect evidence, but to reassure myself that I wasn't imagining patterns where none existed. I noticed how quickly my husband grew impatient when I asked clarifying questions, how often he framed his choices as already settled before I had weighed in, how he described our life to others using I more than we. Still, I stayed calm. I stayed fair. That's the danger of being known as reasonable. Once that label sticks, any discomfort you express risks being seen as irrational, emotional, inconvenient. I didn't want to become that person, the one who complicates things. So I adjusted instead. I spoke less in group settings. I waited longer before responding. I refined my thoughts internally, polishing them until they were unassailable or unnecessary. I told myself I was choosing my battles, but every time I chose silence, something small was taken from me. Not enough to notice right away, just enough to change the balance. No one else saw it happening. Friends still praised our partnership. Family admired how easy we were together. From the outside, nothing was wrong. Inside, I began to feel like a supporting character in my own life, present, competent, replaceable. The first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't hurt enough to demand attention. That's why it mattered. It set a precedent. My voice could be overridden and the world would keep turning. And once that becomes normal, the next cut doesn't feel like a violation. It feels like confirmation. Normalization is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in through repetition, through the steady erosion of what once felt unusual. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic changed. That was the point. The absence of escalation made it easier to accept what followed. Interruptions became routine. Decisions were shared after they were made. My reactions, measured, calm, delayed, were taken as approval. When I did speak up, it was often reframed. You're reading too much into it. That's not what I meant. Why are you making this a thing? Each phrase was delivered casually, without malice. That's what made them effective. They didn't sound like control. They sounded like corrections. I began doing the work of interpretation for everyone else. Translating tone, softening intent, explaining away discomfort before it fully formed. If something felt off, I assumed I'd misunderstood. If I felt dismissed, I asked myself whether I'd been unclear. I became an expert at self-editing. What's dangerous about subtle disrespect is that it recruits you into maintaining it. No one asked me to stay quiet. I chose to because speaking up felt disproportionate, like using too much force for too small a problem. I didn't want to be dramatic. I wanted to be accurate. And so I rationalized. I told myself that relationships require flexibility, that stress changes people, that my husband was under pressure, and pressure makes communication blunt. I reminded myself of his good qualities, of the years we'd invested, of the fact that nothing bad had technically happened. But something had happened. It just didn't have a name yet. I noticed how I prepared mentally before conversations, anticipating resistance, how I rehearsed phrasing to avoid sounding accusatory, how I apologized preemptively. Maybe I'm wrong, but just to make my presence easier to accept. That's when I realized the shift wasn't only external. I was adapting to a version of myself that took up less space. At work, I was still decisive, still respected, still trusted, which made the contrast sharper. I knew how it felt to be heard. I knew how it felt when my input mattered. That awareness made the silence at home louder. But I didn't confront it directly. Confrontation implies certainty. I didn't feel certain, I felt uneasy. And unease is easy to dismiss when everything else looks fine. So I waited. Waiting can look like patience. It can also look like permission. Over time, my husband grew more comfortable narrating reality for both of us. He spoke with authority about our plans, our finances, and our future. He didn't ask for agreement. He assumed alignment. And when I hesitated, even briefly, the response was confusion. I thought we were on the same page. I started to wonder when that page had been written and who had held the pen. Still, I stayed composed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't issue ultimatums. I told myself that staying calm was a strength. Not reacting meant I was above the friction. But calm without boundaries isn't strength. It's availability. The disrespect didn't escalate into cruelty. It didn't need to. It simply became part of the environment, like background noise you stop noticing until it's gone. I learned how to navigate around it, how to minimize its impact, and how to keep things smooth. And everyone benefited from that adaptation, everyone except me. By the time I acknowledged that something was wrong, it already felt normal. That's the trick of normalization. It convinces you that discomfort is just the price of stability, that speaking up is an unnecessary risk. I didn't know then that I was being trained. Not deliberately, perhaps, but effectively. Trained to accept less. Trained to doubt my reactions. Trained to stay quiet long enough that silence became expected. The danger wasn't that my voice was taken from me. It was then that I slowly stopped reaching for it. Roles don't always arrive with discussion. Sometimes they're handed to you through repetition, reinforced by reward. I didn't wake up one day and agree to become the reliable one, the fixer. The person who absorbs inconvenience so others don't have to feel it. I stepped into that role because it was already waiting for me. In my marriage, it looked like this. I was the one who remembered details, who kept track of schedules, deadlines, and obligations that existed quietly in the background. I handled the logistics of our life, the kind of work that doesn't earn gratitude because it prevents problems instead of solving visible ones. My husband handled the narrative. He told people where we were going, what we were building, and what we wanted. He spoke with certainty, with momentum. I stood beside him, nodding, filling in facts when necessary. It felt complimentary at first, like a division of labor. But somewhere along the way, the division became a hierarchy. When decisions needed to be made, I was consulted late. When concerns arose, I was expected to manage them privately. When something went wrong, I helped clean it up. When something went right, it was framed as the result of his initiative. No one said this out loud. It didn't need to be said. The pattern made it clear. I was the stabilizer, the translator, the buffer between intention and consequence. And buffers are meant to absorb impact. I noticed how often people turned to me after conversations with him. Can you talk to him? He didn't mean it that way. You know how he is. The implication was subtle but consistent. It was my job to make him easier to deal with. That expectation didn't come from him alone. It came from everyone. I was reliable. That was my currency. And reliability, when overused, becomes an obligation. There's a strange loneliness in being the person everyone counts on to be okay. Your discomfort becomes inconvenient. Your objections feel like disruptions. So you learn to package them carefully, or not express them at all. I didn't feel powerless. That's important. I felt responsible. Responsible for maintaining equilibrium. Responsible for not overreacting. Responsible for understanding context, stress, and intent. But responsibility without authority is a fragile position. I began to see how the role limited my options. If I pushed back, I risked being seen as difficult. If I disengaged, I risked being accused of withdrawal. The safest path was consistency, doing what I'd always done, because it worked, until it didn't. What I didn't realize then was that the role I'd been assigned required one thing above all else: my silence. Not absolute silence, but selective. Silence at the right moments. Silence when questions might slow things down. Silence when clarity would create friction. I was allowed to speak, as long as it didn't change the outcome. That's a seductive trap. You feel included without being influential, heard without being heated. And because there's no overt conflict, you tell yourself it's fine. I told myself that love didn't need to be loud, that partnership didn't require constant negotiation, that my value lay in my steadiness. But steadiness, when it's assumed, stops being appreciated. It becomes background, infrastructure, invisible. The role I played kept everything running. It also ensured that when the moment came where I couldn't play it anymore, when staying in that role would require me to violate my own values, there would be no confusion about what was expected of me. I was supposed to make it go away, and for the first time I knew I wouldn't. The shift didn't come with a confrontation. There was no argument, no breaking point that demanded immediate action. It came during an ordinary afternoon, in a moment so quiet that no one else would have noticed it happening. I was sitting alone at our dining table, going through paperwork. Bills, insurance statements, the dull administrative texture of adult life. I'd done it 100 times before. This time something caught my attention. Not because it was dramatic, but because it didn't align. A number where I didn't expect one. A date that didn't make sense. At first I assumed it was a mistake. That was my default setting. Assume error before intention. I double-checked, cross-referenced, and recalculated. The discrepancy remained. Small, but precise, not random. I didn't feel panic, I felt focused. That surprised me. I had expected anxiety, maybe denial. Instead, there was a calm narrowing of attention, like a lens adjusting. I followed the thread quietly, pulling one document, then another. Nothing illegal yet. Nothing I could name. Just inconsistencies. What shifted wasn't my understanding of the situation. It was my understanding of myself. I realized I wasn't rushing to explain it away. Normally, I would have stopped there, told myself it wasn't my place, that if something mattered, it would surface on its own. Asking questions might create unnecessary tension. This time I kept going, not out of suspicion, but out of clarity. I wanted to know what I was standing on. That was the thought that anchored me. I need to know what kind of ground this is. There's a moment when curiosity becomes intention. When observation stops being passive, I crossed that line without ceremony. I didn't confront my husband. I didn't hint. I didn't test him with leading questions. I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid of what I'd find, but because I wanted to see without interference. That was new. I began noticing how often I'd deferred in the past, not because I lacked capacity, but because I'd prioritized harmony over accuracy. That afternoon, accuracy mattered more. The shift was internal, but it changed everything. I stopped seeing myself as the person who managed reactions and started seeing myself as someone responsible for truth, mine first. I closed the folder, stacked the papers neatly, and put them away. From the outside, nothing had changed. Dinner was cooked, conversations followed familiar rhythms. My husband talked about his day. I listened, but I wasn't smiling anymore. I wasn't translating, I was observing. I noticed gaps in his explanations. Not lies, just omissions. I noticed how certain topics were framed quickly, efficiently, without room for follow-up. I noticed how often he assumed I'd accept conclusions without seeing the process. Before, I might have asked gentle questions. That night, I didn't. There's power in not reacting when a reaction is expected. Not as a tactic, but as a reset. I wasn't withdrawing, I was recalibrating. I slept well that night. That was another surprise. My body recognized the shift before my mind labeled it. There was relief in no longer carrying the burden of immediate response. I didn't know where this path would lead. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't preparing for a rupture. I was simply no longer willing to look away from misalignment. That day didn't end my marriage. It didn't even threaten it. But it ended a version of me. The one who assumed it was her job to keep everything smooth. From that point on, silence wasn't reflexive. It was a choice. There's a difference between silence as avoidance and silence as intention. I'd lived in the first for years without naming it. The second arrived quietly, without announcement. But once it did, it changed the texture of everything. I stopped filling in gaps. When my husband spoke in generalities, I didn't clarify them for him. When plans were mentioned vaguely, I didn't chase specifics. When assumptions were made about my agreement, I let them sit unconfirmed. Not to provoke, but to see. People reveal a lot when they're not being assisted. At first, no one noticed. That was telling. The system we'd built didn't require my visible participation, only my compliance. As long as things ran smoothly, my internal state was irrelevant. Silence used this way is not absence, it's space. In that space, patterns sharpened. I began documenting, not formally at first, just notes in my black notebook. Dates, statements, numbers that didn't align. I wasn't building a case. I was building clarity. I also began watching myself. How quickly I felt the urge to intervene. How uncomfortable it was to let misunderstandings stand. How often my instinct was to protect, not myself, but the flow of things. Resisting that instinct felt like breaking a habit. Uncomfortable, but strangely energizing. My husband interpreted my quiet as agreement. That's what he'd been trained to do. When I didn't object, he assumed alignment. When I didn't ask questions, he assumed trust. And so he spoke more freely. That's another thing people misunderstand about silence. They think it means you aren't paying attention. In reality, it often means the opposite. I noticed how his stories changed depending on the audience, how certain details were emphasized or omitted, how explanations became cleaner, more confident, when not challenged. Still, I didn't confront him. Confrontation seeks a resolution. I wasn't ready for resolution. I was still gathering truth. At the same time, something else was happening. My sense of self was recentering. Without the constant effort of managing outcomes, I had energy to think, to reflect, to evaluate. I asked myself questions I'd avoided before. What do I actually know? What am I assuming? What would I do if I weren't responsible for keeping things comfortable? Those questions didn't produce immediate answers. They produced patience. Silence became my boundary, not a wall, but a filter. I decided when to speak and when not to. I decided what required a response and what didn't. Others mistook this for passivity. I could see it in their reactions, how they filled the space more quickly, how they became more directive. That didn't alarm me. It confirmed something. People accustomed to being buffered don't recognize restraint as strength. They recognize it as availability. I was no longer available in the same way. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't manipulation. It was alignment. I was no longer willing to lend my voice to narratives I hadn't verified. The silence didn't distance me from my husband emotionally, not at first. We still shared meals, routines, surface intimacy. What changed was my internal posture. I wasn't merging anymore. I was standing. And from that position, certain truths became unavoidable. The more space I allowed, the clearer the inconsistencies became. Not just in finances or timelines, but in values, in assumptions about loyalty, in expectations about what love required me to overlook. Silence didn't create the problem, it revealed it. What no one noticed, because no one was looking for it, was how much I was learning. When you stop intervening, you gain time. When you stop correcting, you gain perspective. And when people assume you're no longer engaged, they stop editing themselves around you. That's when information surfaces, not through confession, but through carelessness. I didn't suddenly become someone else. I didn't change my routines or my demeanor. That consistency was important. It kept the environment stable. It kept expectations unchanged. No one becomes cautious around someone they believe they understand. What changed was how I paid attention. I listened for what was said quickly, as if speed could substitute for clarity. I noted which topics were always summarized instead of explained. I tracked when answers arrived before questions were finished. These weren't dramatic red flags. They were habits. Habits tell the truth faster than statements. At work, I was used to documenting processes, not out of suspicion but precision. That same instinct quietly activated at home. I didn't snoop. I didn't invade privacy. I followed what crossed my path naturally, and I wrote things down. Dates, numbers, versions of the same story told weeks apart. My notebook became less about feelings and more about structure. Not judgment, structure. I wanted to understand the shape of things. I also paid attention to how often I was expected to be the solution. When something was inconvenient, the assumption was that I'd find a workaround. When something risked exposure, it was implied, never stated, that discretion was loyalty. That assumption had always existed. I just hadn't examined it. The more I observed, the more I saw how my role had insulated others from consequence. I was the quiet mediator between intention and impact. And without that mediation, small cracks became visible. Still, I didn't rush. There's a temptation when you start seeing clearly to act immediately, to confront, to resolve, to restore equilibrium. I resisted that. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood something new. Clarity doesn't demand speed. It demands accuracy. I checked my own biases. I asked myself if I was looking for confirmation or simply noticing what had always been there. That's where documentation mattered. Patterns don't argue back. I noticed how financial explanations relied heavily on trust rather than transparency, how temporary decisions extended indefinitely, how certain actions were framed as necessary but never revisited. None of this was explosive. That's important. There was no single revelation that changed everything overnight. Just a growing certainty that I was standing in the middle of a system that depended on my silence to function. And I had stopped providing it. People around me, my husband included, interpreted my quiet as stability. They believed things were fine because I wasn't reacting. They didn't realize that I was repositioning myself internally, step by step. I learned how deeply people rely on the roles others play. When you stop performing yours, even subtly, the imbalance doesn't show immediately. It takes time for gravity to register. I began to see the leverage I'd always had, not over people, but over outcomes, my attention, my agreement, my willingness to smooth edges. That leverage had gone unnoticed because I'd never withheld it. This wasn't preparation for revenge. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. For the first time in a long while, my actions aligned with my values. I wasn't collecting secrets, I was collecting context. And context changes what's possible. By the time I understood the full scope of what I was seeing, the question wasn't what I do. It was what I no longer pretend I don't know. That answer arrived quietly. And once it did, there was no unlearning it. The reveal didn't feel like a shock. There was no rush of adrenaline, no cinematic moment where everything snapped into focus. It felt more like confirmation, quiet, heavy, and final. By the time I understood what I was looking at, I'd already accepted that something was wrong. The question was no longer if, but how much. It came together one evening when I was alone again, the house silent in a way that makes thinking easier. I wasn't searching for anything new. I was reviewing, laying out what I already had mentally and on paper, dates aligned, numbers repeated, Explanations overlapped without connecting, and then the shape appeared. Not a misunderstanding, not poor communication, a deliberate choice. I won't detail the mechanics here. Not because they were complex, but because they were ordinary. That's often how serious wrongdoing hides. Inside routine, inside trust, inside the assumption that no one close enough will look too carefully. What mattered wasn't the method. What mattered was the intent. I saw where decisions had been made with full awareness of their consequences, where risk had been calculated and shifted, quietly, onto others, including me, including institutions that relied on honesty to function, including people who didn't know they were being exposed. This was no longer about discomfort or disrespect. This was about truth. I remember sitting back in my chair and closing my eyes, not in despair, but in stillness. I checked myself for denial. It wasn't there. I checked for anger, also absent. What I felt was clarity, and beneath it, grief. Not for the marriage as it was, but for the version of it I'd believed in. I didn't celebrate the discovery. There was nothing to celebrate. Knowing the truth didn't make me powerful. It made me responsible. That's a reality few people talk about. When you uncover something serious, you don't just gain information. You inherit an obligation, especially when the person involved assumes you'll protect them. I understood immediately what was expected of me. I was supposed to make this disappear, to rationalize, to reframe, to quietly adjust the story so the damage stayed contained. I had done that before, on smaller scales. That muscle was well developed, and my husband trusted it. The realization landed with surprising calm. I will not do that. Not as a declaration, as a fact. I didn't confront him that night, or the next. I didn't test his reaction. I didn't hint at what I knew. I needed to be absolutely certain not just of the facts, but of myself. I asked a harder question. What would staying silent cost me? The answer wasn't abstract. It was specific. It would cost me my integrity. It would make me complicit. It would confirm the role I'd been assigned, that my values were flexible, negotiable, available for use. I wasn't willing to pay that price. Still, I moved carefully. Quiet dominance isn't about exposure. It's about timing, about understanding that once a truth is spoken, it can't be recalled. I documented what mattered. I ensured accuracy. I removed emotion from the process as much as possible, not to detach, but to remain steady. I wasn't preparing for confrontation. I was preparing for consequences. During this time, my husband remained unaware, or perhaps he sensed something and misread it. He seemed relaxed, even confident. He spoke freely. He assumed continuity. That assumption was the last gift my silence gave him. When you privately understand leverage, you don't rush to use it. You recognize that leverage isn't power over another person. It's clarity about what you will and won't protect. I knew then that love, as he understood it, depended on my cooperation, on my willingness to blur lines, to stay reasonable at the cost of truth. Love didn't survive the truth. It never does. But integrity can. And once I knew what I knew, there was only one direction left to move. Forward, on my terms. There's a moment after clarity where time seems to widen. Not slow, widen. Options appear where panic once lived. I found myself standing in that space, looking at paths I'd never allowed myself to consider before. I could stay silent. That was the simplest option, the most familiar. I knew how to do it well. I could protect the image of our marriage, preserve stability, and keep the ground from shaking beneath us. I could tell myself that love sometimes means carrying the weight the other person can't. I could confront him privately, demand explanations, negotiate boundaries, ask for honesty now that I have proof it was missing. That path promised emotional release, maybe even remorse. It also offered something else, containment, a way to keep the truth small. Or I could choose the option that felt the most irreversible, the one that didn't ask me to manage outcomes. I didn't rush this decision. I let it sit with me over several days, moving through ordinary life while holding something extraordinary inside. I went to work, I answered emails, I cooked dinner. I observed how easily routine continues when no one knows the ground has shifted. What made the decision clear wasn't anger, it was alignment. Every option that involved silence, temporary or permanent, required me to play the same role I'd been playing for years, the one who absorbs risk, the one who smooths consequences, the one who ensures others don't have to face what they've done. I finally named what that role cost me. It cost me my sense of self, my credibility with myself, the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your actions match your values. I realized that if I stayed silent now, I wouldn't just be protecting him, I'd be confirming that my integrity was conditional. That was the line. The irreversible option wasn't about punishment, it was about refusal. I refused to become a container for something I didn't create and didn't believe in. I refused to trade truth for comfort. I also understood something else, just as clearly. Once I chose that path, my marriage would not survive it. Not because I wanted it to end, but because it had been built on an assumption I was about to dismantle. The assumption that I would always make it easier. I prepared quietly, not emotionally, logistically. I separated facts from feelings. I sought information, not reassurance. I grounded myself in process. This wasn't about drama. It was about responsibility. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't imagine arguments. I let go of the need to be understood. That was another shift. I wasn't choosing this path to be validated. I was choosing it because it was the only one I could respect. When the moment came to act, it felt strangely calm, not cold, clear. I wasn't stepping into chaos. I was stepping out of a role. I knew there would be fallout, confusion, anger, attempts to reframe what I was doing as betrayal. I accepted that. People interpret refusal through the lens of what they lose. What mattered was that I could finally see myself without distortion. The decision point isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the moment you realize that continuing as you are would be a more serious violation than anything you're afraid to confront. I chose the path that didn't allow for return, not because I wanted to burn bridges, but because I needed to stop crossing myself. And once that choice was made, everything else became procedural. Once the decision was made, urgency disappeared. That surprised me. I'd expected anxiety, maybe a sense of racing against time. Instead, there was steadiness, the kind that comes when you're no longer negotiating with yourself. Moving in silence isn't secrecy, it's restraint. It's understanding that not everyone deserves access to your process, especially when they've benefited from your transparency before. I didn't announce changes. I didn't shift my tone. I didn't create emotional distance that might raise alarms. On the surface, life continued exactly as it had. That continuity mattered. It allowed me to act without interference. I began with structure. I reviewed accounts carefully, not to hide anything, but to understand boundaries. What was shared? What was individual? What assumptions had been made without documentation? I consulted professionals quietly, framing questions hypothetically, factually. I didn't speak in accusations, I spoke in scenarios. Clarity invites cooperation. Emotion invites resistance. I gathered what I needed, and no more. There was no hoarding of information, no dramatic uncovering. I focused on what was verifiable, what could stand without my interpretation attached to it. At the same time, I began disentangling my identity from the role I'd played. That was harder than the logistics. I noticed how often I almost explained myself, how often I wanted to justify small shifts in behavior. I resisted that urge. Silence, now fully chosen, became protective. It kept me from being pulled back into negotiation. It kept the narrative neutral while the reality changed underneath it. My husband remained unaware, or perhaps he sensed something and dismissed it. That's another consequence of underestimation. It makes people slow to recognize change. He still spoke in assumptions, still planned forward without checking alignment, still believed the structure was intact. It was, just not in the way he thought. I didn't stop caring. That's important. Detachment wasn't cruelty. It was containment. I cared enough not to act recklessly, enough not to collapse the system prematurely, enough to ensure that when things surface, they would do so cleanly. There's a misconception that decisive action must be visible. In reality, the most consequential moves often happen without witnesses, not because they're hidden, but because they don't seek validation. I also prepared myself emotionally, not by rehearsing pain, but by releasing expectation. I let go of the idea that this would be understood, or appreciated, or seen as fair. Fairness isn't always symmetrical. Sometimes it's simply accurate. I slept well during this time, ate regularly, went on walks. Those details matter because they grounded me. I wasn't dissociating, I was present. Moving in silence allowed me to act from principle rather than reaction. It ensured that when the consequences began, they wouldn't be fueled by impulse, but by intention. I wasn't laying traps, I was removing myself from complicity. And still, no one noticed. That's the final irony of being underestimated. When you finally move, people assume nothing has changed, until it's too late to pretend otherwise. The system held right up until it didn't. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They ripple outward, subtle at first, like a change in pressure. The people inside the system feel something shift before they understand why. The first signs weren't dramatic, a delay here, a question there, a routine interaction that suddenly required explanation. Nothing that could be traced back to me directly. That was important. The process had its own momentum now. My husband noticed changes before he noticed causes. He became distracted, less certain. I could see it in how often he checked his phone, how his explanations grew longer instead of clearer. He started asking questions he'd never asked before, not of me, but of himself, out loud. I stayed calm, not distant, calm. I didn't offer reassurance. I didn't speculate. I didn't fill in blanks. I let reality do what it does when it's no longer being managed. Others felt it too. Colleagues, associates, people who'd benefited from things running smoothly without understanding how much effort that smoothness required. They sensed friction and assumed it was temporary. That assumption was familiar. What surprised me was how quickly confusion turned into unease. When outcomes change without warning, people look for someone to stabilize them. For the first time, I didn't step in. Not because I couldn't, because it wasn't mine to fix. My husband began to ask me questions, indirect ones, testing the ground. Have you noticed anything strange? Things feel off lately, don't they? Each question carried an expectation that I would help him orient himself. I answered honestly, but minimally. I didn't lie, I didn't reassure. I said things like, I've noticed changes, or I don't know more than what's visible. That was true. The absence of my usual buffering created a vacuum. And in that vacuum, accountability started to surface. He grew frustrated, not with the situation, but with the lack of traction, the lack of someone smoothing the path forward. He wasn't angry at me yet. He was confused by me. Confusion is destabilizing when you've relied on someone's predictability. I watched him cycle through familiar responses: confidence, dismissal, irritation. None of them worked. The system wasn't responding the way it used to, and still I didn't intervene. There's a difference between causing consequences and allowing them. I had done the latter. I had simply stepped aside. That distinction mattered to me. I wasn't enjoying this. There was no satisfaction in watching someone lose footing. There was gravity, seriousness, a sense that something long delayed was finally moving. The marriage changed tone before it changed form. Conversations became careful, then strained, then sparse. He sensed distance and assumed it was emotional. He tried gestures, small kindnesses, casual humor, as if this were a mood to be corrected. I received them politely. But I didn't let them distract me, because this wasn't about affection. It was about truth asserting itself once it no longer had to pass through me. As consequences unfolded, I noticed something else. People began recalibrating how they spoke to me. There was less assumption, more caution, as if some unspoken authority had shifted. Not because I demanded it, because I wasn't available to absorb uncertainty anymore. The role I'd played had ended quietly, and without it, the structure revealed its weaknesses. This was the beginning, not of collapse, but of exposure. And exposure doesn't need drama. It just needs time. By the time panic appeared, the window for repair had already closed. Panic has a different quality than fear. Fear is sharp. Panic is scattered. It scrambles logic, replaces strategy with urgency. I recognized it immediately, not because I'd seen it in my husband before, but because I'd seen it in systems under stress. Things stopped lining up for him all at once. Questions he couldn't answer cleanly. Processes that no longer bent around assumptions. People who suddenly wanted documentation instead of explanations. He came home later than usual, spoke less, then more. His words overlapped, as if speed might outrun consequence. That's when he turned toward me, not with confession, with appeal. He started framing things as our problem, as something we needed to handle together. His tone softened. He asked for my perspective again, something he hadn't done in a long time. He began narrating hypotheticals, carefully omitting certain facts, testing to see how much I knew. I listened. The moment he realized I wasn't stepping in, something in him shifted. The assumption cracked. He asked directly if I was upset, if something was wrong between us, if I were pulling away. I told him the truth, as I had learned to do. "I'm not pulling away," I said. "I'm just not managing this." That answer unsettled him more than anger would have. He tried again, differently this time. He apologized, not specifically but broadly, for stress, for distraction, for not being present. Apologies that circled the issue without touching it. I didn't interrupt, I didn't validate, I didn't reject them outright. I let them land where they landed. That's when urgency crept into his voice. He began speaking in terms of urgency, deadlines, risks, fallout. He asked for help without using the word. He assumed partnership would reassert itself under pressure. It didn't, because a partnership requires consent, and mine had quietly expired. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't understand, was that the point of no return had already passed. Not because of what was happening now, but because of what had already happened. Trust doesn't break all at once. It erodes. And once erosion reaches bedrock, repair isn't a matter of effort. It's a matter of impossibility. He sensed that something fundamental had shifted, but misidentified it as emotional distance. He thought reassurance would fix it. Those promises would restore alignment. But this wasn't about reassurance. It was about accountability. By the time he realized I wasn't going to intervene on his behalf, panic had already taken hold. He cycled through urgency, frustration, and bargaining. He tried to reassert familiarity, inside jokes, shared memories, as if history could substitute for integrity. I watched him reach for tools that had always worked before. They didn't work now. There's a moment when someone realizes they're alone in a situation they assumed would be shared. That moment is unmistakable. His voice dropped, his posture changed, the confidence drained out, leaving something raw behind. He asked me quietly what I was going to do. I answered just as quietly, "I'm not going to cover for this." There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just a statement of boundary. That was the moment he understood, not fully, but enough. Not what I knew or how much I knew, but that I had chosen not to protect him from it. Too late, he tried to fix things. Not by telling the truth, but by negotiating the cost of it. That's when I knew there was nothing left to salvage. Because love that only survives in the absence of truth isn't love, it's dependence. And I was done being the thing that held it together. The confrontation didn't look like what people imagine when they hear the word. There was no raised voice, no slammed doors, no emotional crescendo. By the time we sat across from each other, everything combustible had already burned out, quietly, internally. It happened at the kitchen table, morning light. Coffee gone cold between us. The ordinary setting stripped the moment of drama, which felt right. Truth doesn't need staging. He spoke first. Not defensively, not aggressively, carefully, as if tone alone might soften what was coming. He asked what I knew, not what I thought, what I knew. That distinction mattered. I didn't answer immediately. Not to create tension, but to choose precision. I told him only what was necessary. Facts, not interpretation. Timelines, not accusations. I didn't tell him how it made me feel. I didn't need to. As I spoke, I watched his face. Not for guilt, but for calculation. It appeared briefly, then disappeared. In its place was something else, realization. Not that he'd been caught, that I wasn't going to save him. He tried to explain. Not to deny, but to contextualize. Pressure, short-term decisions, no intent to harm. Familiar language, designed to make wrongdoing sound like circumstance. I listened without interruption. When he finished, he waited. For reassurance, for negotiation, for the version of me that would take what he'd said and turn it into something manageable. I didn't. "I won't be part of this," I said. Not privately, not publicly. My voice was steady. That steadiness unsettled him more than anger would have. He asked what that meant, for us, for the future, for everything we'd built. I answered honestly, "It means I won't lie, I won't hide it, and I won't protect you from the consequences." He stared at me, searching for flexibility. There wasn't any. He tried once more, this time not with logic, but with intimacy. He reminded me of our history, of the years we'd invested, of the life we'd planned. He said my refusal would destroy everything. That's when I understood how differently we define destruction. I'm not destroying anything, I said. I'm just not holding it together anymore. Silence followed, not awkward, final. He didn't argue after that. There was nothing left to argue against. You can't debate a boundary that isn't emotional. You can only accept it or leave. Or, he asked if I was sure. I was. The confrontation ended the way it began, quietly. No resolution, no agreement. Just a clear understanding that the structure we'd shared no longer existed. That night he slept elsewhere. Not as a dramatic exit, as an acknowledgement. Our marriage didn't end with betrayal shouted across a room. It ended with clarity, spoken calmly, and received too late to change anything. I didn't feel victorious, I felt intact. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. After everything settled, I expected emptiness, or grief that would arrive all at once, overwhelming and theatrical. What I felt instead was something quieter, space. Not relief, space. Space where my thoughts no longer had to be filtered, where my reactions didn't need to be managed, where my values didn't require constant compromise to remain palatable. That space felt unfamiliar at first. I had lived so long in adjustment that stillness felt like absence. It wasn't. I began to notice how much energy I'd spent maintaining balance that wasn't mine to maintain. How often I'd measured my words for impact instead of accuracy. How deeply I'd internalized the belief that being reasonable meant being flexible with myself. Without that pressure, I didn't become louder. I became clearer. My days are simplified, not because life got easier, but because it got more honest. I no longer carried knowledge I wasn't allowed to act on. I no longer had to translate reality into something softer so others could live with it. People around me adjusted, slowly. Some expressed surprise at my firmness, as if it were new. It wasn't. It had just never been necessary before. Others drifted away. That didn't hurt the way I thought it would. Distance clarified which connections had relied on my accommodation rather than mutual respect. I learned something important in that period. Integrity doesn't announce itself. It settles. It aligns you with yourself in ways that are subtle but permanent. I didn't rebuild my life dramatically. There was no reinvention montage. I kept my routines. I went to work. I walked familiar streets. I stayed grounded in the ordinary. What changed was my internal posture. I stopped explaining my boundaries. I stopped preemptively softening my stance. When something didn't align, I named it, briefly, calmly, without apology. That alone changed how people interacted with me. I'm still quiet, still observant, still measured. Those traits weren't flaws. They were tools. I just stopped handing them over to be used against me. When I think about the marriage now, I don't frame it as a failure. It was a structure built on an assumption that my silence would always be available as reinforcement. When that assumption collapsed, so did the structure. That doesn't make it tragic. It makes it honest. I don't hate my former husband. Hatred would require emotional investment I no longer carry. I understand him more clearly now, and that understanding includes limits. Love didn't survive the truth, but something else did. I survived with my sense of self intact, with my values unnegotiated, with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly where I stand and why. That confidence isn't loud, it doesn't need to be. It shows up in the way I listen, the way I choose, the way I refuse. And that, I've learned, is enough. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a lesson that fits neatly into a sentence, something instructive, something that makes the loss feel justified by clarity alone. I don't believe life works that way. What I learned wasn't dramatic, it was structural. I learned that silence is not neutral. It always serves something, either truth or its absence. For a long time, my silence served comfort. It kept systems stable. It kept relationships intact. It kept me likable, reasonable, and easy to stand beside. But comfort has a cost, and eventually someone has to pay it. I also learned that loyalty without accountability isn't loyalty. It's avoidance. Real loyalty doesn't ask you to disappear so someone else can remain intact. It doesn't ask you to carry consequences that aren't yours. And it doesn't survive on the assumption that one person will always bend. When I refused to cover up my spouse's crime, I didn't do it to be brave. I did it because I understood something clearly for the first time. Protecting the truth was the only way to protect myself. Love didn't survive the truth. and that's painful to admit. But love that depends on silence is already compromised. It asks you to choose connection over conscience, peace over integrity. That choice doesn't stay abstract for long. Eventually, it becomes a demand. I didn't refuse out of anger. I refused out of alignment. There's a difference. One burns, the other anchors. If there's a moral here, it's not always speak up or never compromise. It's this: pay attention to what your silence is buying and who's paying for it. Being calm doesn't mean being compliant. Being kind doesn't require being invisible. And being reasonable should never mean betraying yourself quietly, so others don't have to feel uncomfortable. Sometimes the most powerful decision you'll ever make won't look like action at all. It will look like a refusal. Calm, unapologetic, final. That kind of refusal doesn't end everything. It ends what was never built to hold the truth. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the person expected to smooth things over, to make it work no matter the cost, I'm curious. Have you ever stayed silent longer than you should have? And what did that silence ask of you in return?